Richard Baker introduced BBC TV's first news bulletin in 1954 and was a regular face and voice on newscasts for almost 30 years.
Here is an illustrated summary of the news. It'll be followed by the latest film of events and happenings at home and abroad.
And here's some film of the Shackleton which first sighted the wreckage this afternoon.
So to begin with, at the second attempt, the space shuttle is at last in orbit around the Earth. At exactly 1 o'clock this afternoon, the Columbia craft was blasted off its launch pad at Cape Canaveral and began the test flight that's due to last until Tuesday evening.
The voice of Richard Baker. Now, one of Richard's sons, the journalist Andrew Baker, joins me now. Andrew, good evening.
Evening to you.
Firstly, it's a very special day for your dad.
Yeah, he's 91 today, yep.
Oh, well, many happy returns to him. How have he, the family, been celebrating?
He's been out with my mother to a concert in the village where they live in Oxfordshire, and both my brother and I and his grandchildren have all spoken to him. He's in great form.
Oh, wonderful news. Well, happy 91st birthday. Going back all those years, do you recall how your father got the job in the first place?
Well, it was long before I came on the scene, but I know that after university and wartime service in the Navy, he was briefly a teacher and then became an actor in repertory companies in Oxford and Northampton. And he was just about to sign a contract with a West End company when the BBC advertised for what would have been continuity announcers on the home service, which we now know as Radio 4. And he auditioned for that and was taken on by the BBC as an announcer on radio on the home service. And then when they first launched BBC Television News, it was a voiceover only service to start with, and they auditioned various of the radio announcers, and he was chosen to do the sound for the first ever television news broadcast. A little later on, when the newsreaders came to be in vision, he was thought to be acceptable looking, and obviously took on that job as well, and was then a BBC newsreader on BBC Television for, I think, 27 years.
Goodness gracious me. And did it matter? Did he ever worry about the fact that he didn't have a traditional journalist's background?
I'm not sure that it concerned him greatly. I mean, I think, first of all, when he took the job on to start with, it was all about presentation skills. The bulletins were written for him, as indeed they are these days, and it was all about clarity of presentation. So in that regard, having a steady nerve and the ability to cope with live broadcasting and a very clear speaking voice, although it sounds rather posh to our ears these days, that was proper BBC pronunciation, and the ability as a trained actor to breathe properly and speak clearly. It was all about delivering the message, the broadcast message, as clearly as possible, because, of course, radio reception and television reception in particular in the early days was nothing like as good in those days as it is now. So delivery, I think, was important. And then later on, in his career, he developed journalistic skills, as it were, on the job, and became an accomplished kind of live radio presenter as well as newsreader, and went on to write a good many books as well. So, he picked up the skills as he went along, rather than being a qualified journalist in the first place.
And bearing in mind there were no other in-vision newsreaders before him in this country to influence him, what do you think did influence his style and delivery? I think
that it helped that he was working for the BBC, and that there was already a great tradition over the history of BBC radio of distinguished broadcasters and sensible, well-modulated delivery. The point about early radio, and I think this is something that still holds true with proper, distinguished broadcasting today, is that it's all about getting the message across clearly, and that applies to how the words are written as well as how they're delivered. So he followed on in that tradition of great British broadcasters, like people such as John Snagg, people who were broadcasting on BBC Radio even before the Second World War. And he had that tradition to follow in. I think when it came to television presentation, he and his early colleagues were blazing a trail in a sense, but then they were sitting at a desk, and really the challenges were more about mastering the early days of the auto cue and dealing with the technical breakdowns, which were much more frequent in those days. They were dealing with film, they were dealing with dodgy telephone lines. It was a lot more nerve-wracking live broadcasting than I think it is these days.
The way you describe it makes it sound absolutely terrifying. The way news is delivered has changed an enormous amount since your father started all those years ago. Do you think it's for the better?
I think that it's different. And let's face it, the range of news that is broadcast is vastly, it's just enormous compared to what was available then. When he started, the news on television was basically my father and his BBC colleagues. ITV didn't get going for a couple of years afterwards. And when I was growing up, it was essentially my father and his colleagues or ITV. That was that when it came to broadcast television news. The landscape, as we know these days, is enormous, and not only on television but online. There is non-stop news available from hundreds of different sources, so people can to some extent please themselves. Among that variety is a great variety and a great many levels of competence and clarity. I'm obviously biased, but I think that the BBC still does a terrific job on its mainstream, main channel television broadcast. But I think it's useful that there are all-day, 24-hour channels so that people can get the news anytime they want to. I must say I still like a regular bulletin that sums it all up in a clear and reliable and unbiased way. So I guess I'm bound to be biased, maybe old-fashioned as well.
Well, maybe I'm a bit too. No, it is interesting you say that, because obviously doing the show like this, I'm surrounded by all the news that comes in from all our stations, and I, like you, look at the websites, etc., etc. But I still, the show starts at 7, and I still watch the BBC News at 6 before coming in to do the programme. I don't know, it's sort of comforting in a way. Nice text from Ian in Milton Keynes here. Richard Baker, brings back my childhood. The narrator of Mary, Mungo and Midge. I'd forgotten that.
Oh, yes. Many strings to his bow.
Wonderful. Andrew, thank you so much. And again, wish him well on his 91st birthday. It's been a delight to have you on the show.
Thank you
so much. Journalist and writer Andrew Baker, son of Richard Baker, 91 years old today.